Kenneth Kidd, who is a professor of English at the University of Florida. He's the author of 3 books on a wide range of topics connected with children's literature, most recently, Theory for Beginners, and co-editor of 6 more, most recently, Alt Kid Lit, What Children's Literature Might Be. With Elizabeth Marshall, he co-edits the Children's Literature and Culture book series at Routledge. Kenneth Kidd.
Yay!
How's the mic? Is it okay?
Yes,
Okay.
it's good.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, Kenneth.
Okay, great. I'm going to move and try to stay in focus here.
Yeah.
Donnie can tell me if I'm not. Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you so much, everybody. Hi. How is everybody?
We're great.
It's really been a fantastic time so far. It's great to see all of you here, and thanks for the presentations we've heard. Thanks to Flo for that lovely introduction, and thank you for these gifts. This is exciting. I've very much enjoyed being a member of the society, and I look forward to learning from people, from all of you, for a long time. So, okay, well, so today I'm going to talk, as you can see, about Green Kidlit, Florida environmental writing for kids, for young people, kids and teenagers, essentially. And this talk, I know the print is tiny. This talk is basically a sort of based on one of 6 chapters in a book that is now under contract, I'm happy to say, with the University Press of Florida. I may be jinxing this because it still does have to go through a final round, but I do have advanced contracts, so if anybody gives me trouble, I'll say I'm a lifetime member of the Roger Kenneth Rollins Society. But the book will has 6 chapters dealing with historical fiction, environmental literature, travel and tourism, children's literature. There's a chapter on Zora Neale Hurston and Rawlings for kids. I spoke about Hurston last year, specifically about retellings of Hurston's work and attributions to Hurston. And there have been a number of additional ones since I spoke with you last year by Ibram Kendi. And in any case, that chapter deals with that. The 5th chapter is on the Cuban diaspora and the huge body of work for kids that's about that history, which is complicated, as we know. And the last one is We Say Gay, Florida Queer Enchantments. It's sort of establishing that there is, in fact, a tradition of LGBTQ literature for kids, about kids in Florida, that has a Florida context and a Florida history. So just to give you a little bit of sense of broader context. So the book basically is an impossible book in the sense that it's too long. There are hundreds of titles that I'm trying to deal with, and but it's a story that I think is an interesting story. So I'm just going to give you a little slice of it today, and that's on the environmental part. I do want to say 1 or 2 other things, which is that the overall story of Florida children's literature is really one of diversification in terms of both genre and form, right? So an expansion of the kinds of materials that we see, but also a diversification in terms of people. Right? Who's in the stories and who gets to write them, and what populations of Florida are part of a literary tradition. And so that is a positive arc over the 200 years or so that we're talking about. Some of the other interesting trends, there's still a focus on small town and rural life. We don't actually have as much about cities as we might expect, city settings. It tends largely to be realist. There is a bit of a kind of magical realist tradition, and I'll talk about a couple of titles that pick up on that. So those are kind of broad strokes, some of the overall trends for Florida children's literature, as a category, right? Okay, so the environmental story. I'm going to tell you kind of a small version of this history in 4 parts. The first part is the longest, so if you're thinking he's taking forever, this is going to be, it will not. And Flo will also tell me if I'm going on too long. Exactly, she'll pull me out with the hook, or come lean on me very suggestively.
That's what I do.
In any case, the environmental story is interesting because, in a way, you can sort of say that Florida literature has always been kind of a literature of the environment, right? I mean, especially if we think about the preoccupation with this startling, gorgeous landscape of flora and fauna, and with the rich history of that. That's really been true from the beginning. I think we can make that case, whether we're looking at the Spanish language tradition, whether we're looking at the Anglophone tradition. If we're talking about a literature of conservation and protection, that's what sort of emerges a little more slowly, right, over the course of the 20th century. And so it's really sort of starts to kind of take shape around the mid-20th century. So I'm leaning here, of course, on the work of environmental historians. Jack Davis, who I believe is a friend to this society, and formally, if not formally, as well as Leslie Kemp Poole, who's written beautifully on the history of environmentalism, and especially looking at the contributions of women environmentalists to that story. So I was interested in thinking about the literature against the sort of history that they identify, right, looking at other kinds of documents. Like, do we see this in the literature, in the creative literature? And I think we do. It is, to some extent, a story of progress, but maybe not only or simply that. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some key genres. So the first part, which again is the longest, but I'll be as quick as possible, is basically, I've titled it Nature Awareness and Social Sleuthing in Serious Adventure Fiction. So this is late 19th, early 20th century series fiction for boys and girls both. I see a lot of you nodding heads like, oh yeah, I know what you're talking about. It is really a rich body of work and pretty funny. It's unsurprising, of course, that in this literature, Florida would figure pretty prominently. Florida was pretty clearly still a kind of frontier for a lot of writers, and especially in the boys' series fiction, Florida is a kind of landscape where boys can test their character building and kind of go out into the wild and sort of develop their skills and so forth. So we get some examples of that in the titles I've put up here, which you may not be able to see very well. The one on the far left is A.W. Demick's Dick in the Everglades. And in this book, Dick Williams and his pal Ned Barstow are restless school chums at a residential academy in New England who keep sneaking out to camp in the middle of the night. They just can't help themselves. They've got to get out in nature. Thankfully, they're soon off to Big Cypress, where Ned's dad owns a tract of land. And a sort of similar scenario plays out in the second title there, Boy Chums in the Forest. This is Wilmer Matteo Eli's Boy Chums in the Forest, which is subtitled Hunting for Plume Birds in the Florida Everglades. And I imagine that's a familiar topic. I'll come back to that in a second. If the Florida frontier is ideal for active, attractive, and restless boys, and they are generally attractive, it is also ideal for boys with too much civilization, and that includes this attractive boy. You probably can't see this text, but this is from Kirk Monroe's Canoe Mates. Monroe was one of the most prolific writers for boys, and also, frankly, a very interesting character and a pretty committed environmentalist. But in this particular story, one of the protagonists is a boy named Worth Manton. I would say you can't make these names up, but he did, right? Worth Manton, who was, at first glance, you would think he was an effeminate boy. But if you look more closely, you'll see a square chin and flashing eyes. And pretty soon, he goes on a paddle or a canoe trip, right, down in the Everglades. And this, of course, wipes out all those nasty traces of feminizing civilization from him, and he can be on his way. So this is a kind of fairly typical sort of portrayal, but there are other things actually happening in some of these titles. Monroe's work is often actually very, very, as I said, very kind of proto, if not explicitly environmentalist. And this passage from Wakala is a story of adventure in Florida, 1885, is actually about a family that goes down south, actually goes to the Keys and are kind of witnessing one of the wrecking operations. We were talking about wrecking earlier. And they go out to see the reef, and it's just this gorgeous passage about how beautiful it is and how striking it is, and Monroe's work is filled with these kinds of passages, with or without kind of editorializing, usually without. I won't read all of these, I promise, but just so you can, those in the back may not be able to see it. As the clear water was without a ripple, they could look far down into its depths and see the bottom with branching coral, as beautiful as frosted silver. From among its branches sprang great sea fans, delicate as lacework, and showing, in striking contrast to the pure white of the coral, the most vivid reds, greens, and royal purple. These and masses of feathery seaweeds waved to and fro in the water as though stirred by a light breeze, and among them darted and played fish as brilliant in coloring as tropical birds. The boat seemed suspended in midair above fairyland, and even the children gazed down over its sides in silence, for fear lest by speaking they should break the charm and cause the wonderful picture to vanish. Pretty striking writing, and not maybe what you'd expect to see in boys' adventure fiction from the period, and in fact, it's not typical in a lot of ways. But so this is early, right? This is 1885, so we start to see a little bit of that kind of commitment, the kind of romantic feeling for nature merging into something like a kind of early environmental awareness. And there are other examples of this, and Monroe's other work, he talks at length, for example, in one of the titles about how coral reefs are actually built, how mangrove sort of areas are formed. There's extensive information about alligators and alligator reproduction, even, which is a whole thing, and descriptions of birds that go on for pages and pages. So the big issue of the day, of course, was plume hunting, and this is, of course, a practice that I'm sure most of you know a lot about. It was, of course, an international concern because it wasn't only a problem in Florida, but it was a huge problem in Florida, right? The estimates, you may have seen these kinds of statistics. The plumes or feathers were, from the hunted birds were used to decorate hats, and estimates are that by 1900, more than 5 million birds were being killed every year in Florida, including 95% of Florida's shore birds. And so, of course, there were all kinds of efforts to stem this practice, to criticize it. And this also shows up in the literature as well, and including some of the children's books. So, in St. George Rathborne's book, for example, The Boy Cruisers, and you have to love all these titles. Boy Cruisers, 1893. Before this passage, which is about how fabulous the Audubon Society is, before that, there's a long section sort of just basically decrying not only the practice, but politicians looking the other way and refusing to do something about it. And then we have this incredible passage about the Audubon Society, and anyway, it's a pretty interesting emergent literature. Another example, just to give you one or two more examples. There's another. This is very much a serious book, The Motor Boys Among the Florida Keys, and there's a whole exchange between two boys that basically, recapitulates or encapsulates what the practice is, how horrible it is, and why something needs to be done about it. And it's amazing. And also just about the emotional, despair that people feel when they see not only the dead birds, but all these poor baby birds, right, that are just left to starve. So it's actually pretty haunting. And this is something that Florida writers still talk about. The other thing I would just quickly emphasize in this section is that there is also a kind of real awareness that the environmental challenges, environmental displacement, comes also as part of overdevelopment and sort of the beginning of sort of just basically genocide in terms of the indigenous Floridians. And so in The Boy Chums, another great title, Cruising in Florida Waters, there is a passage which you absolutely cannot see, which I will not read to you, but it is essentially a Seminole boy talking to these two white boys who are slowly wrapping their minds around some of these realities and saying basically, we are homeless people, your race took all of this except this swamp. And then they go back and forth about the ethics of this. And at one point, ultimately the author seems to kind of shy away from the critique and says, well, progress, that's what happens. It sucks, but that's what happens. And so there's a kind of really interesting ambivalence about that back and forth. All right, what about girls' fiction? Really quickly here. Serious fiction for girls tended not to be quite as outdoorsy. There are some exceptions, but for the most part, these books that came slightly later, most of the series, although a few were 19th century, And they, like the boy books, tend to feature small groups of girls together, so like two to four is usually the magic kind of number. So the Automobile Girls was a very popular series. And in these books, the girls do have a kind of relationship to the natural environment, but they also are sort of focused on social dynamics and solving mysteries in town. So in the first one, the girls at Palm Beach is actually essentially a kind of heist and sort of pseudo-murder situation that they're involved with solving. So it's the girl detective, actually. And that's what caught my interest, because there's a real thread across the 20th century into the current moment about girl sleuths, and I think that's something that's pretty pervasive. And in the Girl Scouts of the Cardinal Patrol, which was the second book on the right there in 1931, this does have a lot of kind of nature study. There's a lot of shelling. There's a lot of discussion of birds. In this particular passage, they go to the alligator farm in St. Augustine and are staring at the alligators and talking about that. But they're actually pretty interesting books. Okay, second part, and this is where I go really fast and Flo doesn't have to yank me off the stage. Second part, frontier stories and greened Robinsonades. Frontier stories, obviously, in frontier stories, nature is both ally and adversary, right? We see that very clearly in the yearling. That's probably one of the most, famous examples. But even frontier stories have kind of environmental aspects, right? We've talked about how attuned Rawlings was to the natural environment and how stunningly, gorgeously she writes about it. We heard, of course, Jonathan talk about this and just about the ways in which, that suffuses a lot of her work. And so even in frontier stories, we have it. Robinsonades, I don't know if you're familiar with that term, but it means shipwreck stories, right? So these are stories that are kind of styled after Robinson Crusoe. And they're very popular still, and they've been adapted to other kinds of scenarios. So there's like stories of plane crashes, for example, that are essentially Robinsonades, where people are shipwrecked in a wilderness or away from civilization and must survive and maybe even thrive, depending on the version. There's quite a few sort of Robinsonades that start to have an environmental message, and I thought it might be interesting to show you briefly what a couple of those were. The other thing, kind of note about this, is as frontier stories became less dominant, and it was sort of like there were fewer actual stories of shipwreck, the Robinsonade tradition kind of gets interiorized, like adapted to the land. So if you think about the yearling, right, they're living on Baxter's Island. There was that hurricane that essentially does flood everybody. But there's already a sense that they have chosen, actually, to be shipwrecked, and that they're kind of living in this special island of hammocks, of island of pines. The language in a lot of these books sort of borrows from what's essentially a nautical genre and kind of adapts it to the land, which I think is super interesting. So that's true for these two works a little bit too, especially the one on the right, Jean Craighead George's The Missing Gator of Gumbo Limbo. But the Alligator Crossing has some elements of that too. It's actually sort of a pirate story, sort of a conservation story. This, of course, is Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. And she wrote, in addition to River of Grass, she wrote several children's novels. Freedom River, which is a super interesting book, and Alligator Crossing, which was published in 1959, which is a story of Florida waterways, really. A kind of boy kind of like accidentally runs away with sort of a pirate who's actually like a gator trapper, and they find their way down the Miami River, down the East Coast, around the tip, and back up into the 10,000 Islands. And they have a very difficult relationship, but it's also kind of about the hunting of alligators and the regulation of alligator size, and that was kind of all happening around that time, where there was sort of restrictions on how big the alligator could be or how small the alligator could be. In any case, it's a really, really interesting book, and you really do start to see a conservationist ethic there. That's probably the book where you see it most explicitly. And then in The Missing Gator of Gumbo Limbo, you've got basically, it's a story of a small human community in a hardwoods hammock. It's probably in the Everglades, but well, kind of not far from Naples, really. And there is a resident alligator his name is Dajun, I think, And he is sort of the protector of this community, and it's basically the people that live in the community are living in the woods. This is a small group of people, but they've all basically been kind of either cast out of society or they found it difficult to thrive in society. And of course, the author knows she can't leave them there by the end of the book, especially in a children's novel.
Yeah, right.
But it's kind of about the human ecosystem as well as the environmental ecosystem. And they have kind of chosen, in a way, to be in this kind of shipwrecked sort of situation or scenario. But it's actually an eco-mystery. And this was one of the genres that really starts to develop in the 70s, is the environmental mystery, where there's some problem. And usually if you apply some detective work and you maybe consult some experts or you figure out, you interview people, you can solve the environmental mystery. In this case, it's not, as it becomes later, a mystery about pollution or about some horrible story about, as that we have later, about Big Sugar. In this case, it's more about just a kind of what's happening. It is a little bit what's happening with the overpopulation, but it's not as direct as in some of the others. Third category, this is, I promise again, speedy. The next big category is becoming animal/activist. And I put them together on purpose because it is the beginning of a tradition where you have children's books not just about, hey, we really shouldn't pollute, or maybe conservation is a thing, to let's get those bastards who are destroying this place, right? Let's protect those animals, let's shut down this nonsense. And you also have a kind of tradition of storytelling where people bond with animals, and there's an animal affinity, but it's not a pet relationship, right? There's a kind of like reciprocal mutuality, and Raoul and the Porpoise is one of my favorite examples of this. And it's basically a feral child story, but unlike, if anybody remembers Mowgli in the Jungle Book, Mowgli eventually goes to live with people again. The boy who's raised by dolphins tries, not a good experience, and he kind of says, yeah, never mind, thanks, I'm back to dolphin culture. And it's sort of also a great book about dolphins and about dolphin biology, etc. But of course, Carl Hyacin is the major, practitioner of the animal activist story, and that began with Hoot. He has written now a series of books for middle grade or YA, authors, YA readers rather, that all have this kind of, family resemblance to his stories for adults. That have similar kinds of plot lines. The villains are evil developers. Yeah. They're always just looking to make money. And in Hoot, it's a pancake house that wants to open its 100th location on a habitat of a burrow and owl. Yeah. And so Hyacin, of course, has a lot of fun with this. And the characters, one of the characters is Mullet Fingers. And he's basically like, if you know Hyacin's work, he's Skink Jr. So he's sort of like the wild man off the grid who's living in the woods, and it turns out his family's messed up, and this is probably a better life than it would be with his current family. And then the protagonist has a more respectable middle-class background. But in any case, Hyacin is the one who's kind of brought us into that. One or two more examples of this tradition, and I'll start to wind down. There was a film version of Hoot, which is fantastic.
Yes.
I think it's good, actually. But there's been some criticism, but it's an interesting film. But you can see they're standing off against the bulldozers. In the novel, they actually start out trying to discourage the development gently, and then they get more and more radical as the book goes along. And pretty soon they're tying up the foreman. And before that they were just doing things like dumping alligators in the porta potties and seeding the place with water moccasins, that kind of thing. Just want to mention, if you're interested in the eco-mystery, Bonnie Dorr. Books are also super interesting. Here you've got the Girl Sleuth again, which is, I think, a much more interesting tradition in lots of ways. And these are keys set, and each of her novels deals with basically abuse of certain kinds of keys populations, key animal populations. So obviously key deer, pelicans, and turtles. And in these books, Kinsey, she's the Girl Sleuth activist, she's always plunging into something, plunging into the underbrush, plunging into the river, plunging into trouble, basically. That's just sort of what she does. But she actually is sort of your model for your child activist. And she's about 14, 15, so pretty young. any case, she is a super interesting writer. In that tradition also, well, this one's a little different, but in that tradition also, Strange Birds by Celia Perez, fantastic book that has both an environmental justice motif with the girl detectives and a social justice motif that are kind of connected in super interesting ways. I love this book, and Celia is also an alum of our department, but it's such a good book. I really recommend it. She's a really interesting writer. So that's kind of it for that, and I'm just going to start to stop here because I know I'm pushing my time. But the last category of books is I'm calling Nature Bites Back, which you start to have with the animal activist tradition, right? But what we really have in this category is nature is fed up, and these are stories in which nature actually kind of has vengeance, basically, in some way or the other. And probably the most famous one is a book by Edward Blurred called Tangerine. And in the quote that I have here, the title character is basically talking about why lightning keeps striking in places where it's not supposed to, or places that used to strike all the time, but because people, have just developed this land without thinking about it, lightning remembers. And his mother was like, lightning does not remember. That's not how he said, oh, yes, it does. And what's really weird about this book was published in 1997. The other thing that happens is a sinkhole opens up under the middle school because, of course, someone faked getting a permit, right? And so a sinkhole opens up, and it happens on September 11th. I'm not kidding you. It's so bizarre. I've never actually had a chance to ask Laura about it. You also have hurricane stories, which are very, very. Hurricanes are always complicated realities and also complicated metaphors, right, for all kinds of things. And these writers do not say hurricanes are ways of getting back, but hurricanes become sort of metaphors for hope, for despair, for destruction, for renewal, for a lot of things, right? So I think I'll stop there. There are, of course, lots of nonfiction titles now about conservation. And my overtime, which I will not do, but I will just tell you, is that there are also a lot of really interesting stories for teenagers about springs and bodies of water. And there's a kind of interesting connection there between sort of the elemental, we were talking about the elemental a little while ago as well, and about water and the importance of water in Rawlings. This is something that is super interesting, and there are a number of writers from Swim to Me, Betsy Carter, to Jenny Myers Sain's One Last Breath, which is set in a springs. I have a long story about the creature, but we won't go into that. Breathing Underwater, which I think is one of the first kind of gay texts set in Florida by a Florida writer, Lou Vickers, who also very, very well known for doing these gorgeous illustrated histories of tourist hotspots like Weeki Wachee and Cypress Gardens and so on. Also wrote a really, really terrific book in 2007, kind of about a queer survival story, really, kind of brutal actually. Her family is really problematic. So it intersects with that, sort of in the same tradition. That's my last slide, I promise. There are connections between social and environmental action, and that's what starts to get threaded a little more clearly in the contemporary stories. We see it especially in that Strange Birds book by Perez that I recommended so strongly. It's a really nicely done there. So all right, so I know I've talked too long. Thank you. I'm assuming we need to stop, right?
No questions?
Are we sure? Okay,
Yeah.
sure. Yeah.
The writers then for the 19th century and the turn of the 20th century, do those writers actually live in Florida or they live up north?
That's a great question. The answer is both, and you're right to ask that. We do start to get writers who, they didn't live in Florida, spent significant time here. A lot of them wintered and then started doing that. That's what's interesting is a lot of the tourist and travel stories in general become kind of like a second wave settler literature, right? Because you think about that, even snowbird stories could be understood in that tradition. So both is the answer. A few of them moved. Monroe was there a lot, but some of the others it's true, were just picking Florida for one of their 23 titles that they had in the series. So you do see that, and they're not the ones I linger with much in the book because it's pretty superficial. So thank you. It's a great question. Yeah.
Were those early books, like during the Edwardian time and so forth, were they well received? Were they good sellers?
You know, that's a really good question. I don't know the answer. I mean, I think they must have been well received enough that they they did sell. I know that. You know, there wasn't much of an apparatus of reviewing for those books, so I haven't come across a lot of reviews. The only exception to that is Kirk Monroe, whose work I've mentioned. He was recognized as a writer of distinction in terms of the quality of the writing. And there were some pretty positive reviews in major newspapers across the United States. Mostly, you know, most of that infrastructure was in the Northeast. But yeah, it's a good question. I think that would be that kind of research I haven't done, and it would be interesting to see.
Yeah, it would be interesting to see where they were actually selling. Or
Yeah, they were selling, and you know, I remember Maurice O'Sullivan. The only article about children's literature that I can find is by Maurice O'Sullivan. It's mostly in the 19th century, but he does say at the end of that article, he says, well, you know that Florida finally arrived when it was a setting for the Bobbsey Twins title. You know, and it's like number 29 in the series or something, and yeah, so thank you.
Good.
I have one question. Did you notice that Kenneth does a lot of work with gender roles, etc. The boys' books were like about cruising, and the girls' books were about patrolling, right? Like enforcement of different things. So that would be an interesting contrast to sort of like look into the different motifs.
No, that's a really good point, because it's not just about domestic versus the outdoors, but there is a little bit of, it's interesting because they are kind of transgressive too in some ways. Within the space of patrolling and scouting, they get to do more things, you know, but there still seem to be like limits to how outward bound they can be.
Right.
That's a great point. Yeah, thank you. Yes.
Were those patrolling stories a precursor to the Nancy Drew?
Were they?
The Nancy Drew?
Yes. Yes.
And the Hardy Boys?
Yeah, so Nancy Drew introduced in 1930, so very much beginning to be the prototype. And Nancy Drew, of course, still very spunky, very outward bound, a little more respectable in some ways, but I think you're right. I think it's definitely in that tradition. And so the Stratemeyer Syndicate, of course, was producing many of those series fictions, and produced some of these as well.
Same publisher?
There are a couple, but some of them, yes. And others not so much, but even when they weren't exactly the same, it was often the same kind of model for developing the stories. Yeah, good. Yeah, thank you.
Wow.
All right, I will stop. Thank you so much again, and thank you again for these beautiful things.